Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Clady.
Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of the Voyage podcast. I'm your host, Mike.
And I'm Jacob.
And we're going to do what every comics podcast is required to do, and that's talk about Batman. So for this one, we're going to just go a little bit into what inspired this episode, because so much has been done in terms of the Christian symbolism, imagery, Christian themes, content in the Batman comics, the Batman movies, Batman everything. We're not going to just going to rehash everything that we've heard, but we're going to try to find some maybe different or new or fresh avenues and perspectives in this conversation. But first, let's talk about the inspiration for this episode, other than, like I said, the fact that every comics podcast has to do a Batman episode.
Well, yeah, no, it's legal. It's legally binding. You know, if you're not reading the fine print when you buy those podcast mics, folks, you really got to, because you'll find in there that if it says, if you plan on using this microphone for a podcast,
we were like
the first year,
2 days from the deadline. Yeah,
it was close. They were about to. I was getting red notices in my mail.
Oh yeah,
it was
the ones
close.
that's when you start reading it, right?
And I'm normally just throwing those out, right? It's by the grace of God that I even bothered to open that one. So
and it was timely, not necessarily under the best of circumstances, but we're actually recording this. We know that it's not being released around this time, but we're recording this in about a week or so, less than a week actually, since we both found the news that Kevin Conroy, the voice of Batman in the 1990s, early 1990s Batman the Animated Series show, along with a ton of other stuff, to be honest. But
everything.
Yeah, all the video games and everything like that.
If you played any of the Arkham games, he came back to do the voice for those, which was fantastic, along with Mark Hamill for the Joker. The real claim to fame for Mark Hamill.
Yeah, I was going to say, is
none of
he
that crazy
famous for anything
Galaxy
else?
stuff. Yeah, I don't think so. I can't think of one.
So, anyway, we're recording this pretty soon after that, and that's partially because that role especially, or that character, the Batman the Animated Series, was pretty formative for both of our understandings of Batman. I was a young kid when the cartoons came out. Jacob, you were much older, I'm sure, but but I was a young
years older.
Yeah, a few.
Yeah. Just a few.
We were
seeding these criticisms early on. I see, Mike. I see what you're doing, bro.
It's what we call banter, I think. But
it's called misinformation, and if this goes on YouTube, you're going to get kicked off.
Oh gosh. Yeah. I think somebody would have to watch or listen to this first. So anyway.
Hey, before we get into all that, can I just ask, how did you mourn Kevin Conroy's passing? Certainly with Ash, certainly with ripped robes, certainly with wailing.
So
but in addition to all that,
it was it was actually a little bit of a tribute, because not only was it to prepare for this conversation that we were going to have, but I did actually go back and watch some of the Batman animated series. I didn't want to just find episodes that I had already remembered very well, vividly from my childhood, but watch some of the lesser known or less familiar episodes. One of the things that I found is season 1 is far superior to 2 and 3, but
that's good.
But I did find some. Yeah, it was just it was fun to kind of go back and hear some of the corny jokes that actually Bruce Wayne and Alfred would tell each other, and some of the lesser known characters and things like that. So I would say that was I wouldn't consider it so much a mourning as it is a
celebration of life.
A celebration of the artistic work. The artistic work.
All right, I guess I'll allow that.
Okay.
No, I love. Yeah, you're right. The first season, especially of Batman the Animated Series, has that really, really wonderfully timeless art style, where the art style evolves over time, and I don't hate the later art style. I'm fine with it, but that early season looks like it could have been drawn in the 40s. And that's just fine. If you ever go back and watch those, was it Fleshers, Flesh something, the Supermans, the old 40s Supermans. Anyway, all you listeners who are nerdier than I will, excoriate me over getting the Flesh guy's name wrong. But those cartoons are awesome. They're fantastic, and very much an inspiration for what they were doing on that animated series show, and especially the first season. It really comes across.
Well, so like you said, the visual artistic style, it's as a show based off of a comic should be, but then the writing style, the story structure, very much has that kind of noir mystery element, which again, like that's what, at least from my formation, my understanding, Batman was much more that than an action hero. Even though obviously it has that elements, but go ahead, sorry.
No, it's all right. That show is the perfect Batman. It is the appropriate interpretation of Batman, the litmus test for how Batman is to be understood in his purest form, in his purest distillation. And I mean that in any medium. That includes comics, folks. Now, I mean, maybe some people are going to think that's a crazy thing to say or whatever, but he's evolved so much and been through so many different permutations in comics. I mean, certainly that's always going to be kind of the originating form for Batman. There's no doubt. But everything about Batman's description, like presentation in Batman the Animated Series, is the perfect embodiment of it. And you said, you were, laughing or enjoying the fact that he has this kind of pleasant banter and joking around with Alfred and things like that, is because Batman's a far more balanced character in his purest state. At least this is the argument I would make. Then he tends to be, dark and broody, and he is. There's very dark, broody elements to him, like a huge amount of it. But
and actually, this is one of the themes.
He's also more than that.
Well, and it like you said, it shows that kind of well-roundedness to him, which one of the themes is that even though he's like, I am vengeance or I am justice or whatever, I mean, he's not a, he's a fully formed person or a three-dimensional person. He's not just a trope for one idea. And so him having that, without kind of saying it, that more human side, shows you that he's, and I know not a real person, but he's a much realer character than, like I said, just that kind of symbol that, I don't know, he's sometimes caricatured to be, I guess. Just a big kind of grunting.
The creators, the very content creators of Batman caricature him, right? The dark brooding version of Batman, all right, I told Mike before this show started that he had no idea what box he was opening up when he introduced Batman onto this podcast. I'm a pretty big fan, folks, and I've spent an inordinate amount of my time in this life kind of meditating upon all things Batman. Admittedly, I've been a little bit out of it the last few years, but I have a lot.
And part of our conversation here before this podcast was how we were both trying to get our kids more interested, and how they're just both letting both of our sets of kids are letting us down because they're not as into it as not just that we want them to be, but as much as they should be objectively.
Well, and specifically about Batman the Animated Series, because that is, like you were saying, such a formative thing. The Tim Burton Batmans and the animated series were the thing that got me into Batman. And then it was comics, and then it was, I guess eventually video games and things like that. But my kids, I try to show them Batman the Animated Series, and it just doesn't impress them. And so they didn't eat for a week. But, they were a lot more enthusiastic the second time we sat down.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So there's a parenting lesson for everybody. But no, what I was about to say is there's and this will be as far as I take this tangent. We can get back on track. But there is a version of the old version of Batman, right? Like the Dark Knight Returns Batman has basically become canon for the arc of Batman in most mediums, where he doesn't have a happy ending, more or less, right? I guess it kind of depends upon how you want to define happy and things like that. But the only version of Batman that doesn't end up just either never stopping his endless fight against villainy up into death, right, is the one from Christopher Nolan's films. It's like the only version of Batman I've ever seen, period. Outside of like whatever, like, well, I think he marries Catwoman in, the Golden Age Earth, which is cool. Hey, I'm down with that. That's exactly what should happen. That's how Batman should end.
Well, was it sacramental? That's what I...
Maybe in the Golden Age it would have been, right? It might not have been too late for that. But so you can say that Batman's dark and grim and brooding in his old age, and that's appropriate. But young Batman isn't that cynical yet. So anyway, we'll get back on track with what you want to talk about.
So, I wanted us to first kind of talk about what was sort of not just the obvious inspiration of this episode. Like I said, it's a comics podcast. It's a Christian comics, Catholic comics podcast. So not just the inspiration of you got to do a Batman, but what specifically to both of us. And then the other big thing was, if you go to the Voyage Comics blog, you can, or you just search Voyage Comics Batman, you'll find numerous posts, reflections, articles, things like that, asking questions. Why do we like Batman? Talking about the relationship between Batman and suffering, the relationship somewhat obscurely or indirectly, but between Batman and mental health as well. When you think of the different traumas that he experiences, obviously going back to his parents being killed in his, in his origin story, but we can draw so much spiritual fruit from it, and so many people already have. And so we wanted to, just kind of build off of what Voyage has already kind of done and added to it, but then sort of give our own sort of conversation, our own 2 cents to it as well, from our experiences, from our just reflections, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But who's your favorite bad guy from the animated series, really quick?
You mean outside the Joker, right?
Well, so that's, yeah, okay, fine. Besides.
Okay. Oh man, it's like picking my children, Mike. I mean, I like Catwoman. I like Batman's relationship with Catwoman. But if you want a less kind of like obvious answer, a less whatever, I like. Man, I like them all because they all have... Here's the thing about Batman's villains, and this isn't going to be new to anyone who's, read anyone say anything ever about Batman's villains, but they're all inversions of him, right? Or they're all kind of an imbalanced, taken to an extreme version of like what he does. So in some ways...
Well, and that's going to be part of our conversation later too, actually.
But anyway, so a little sneak preview, yeah. So it's like every time I think of a possible, kind of cool option to give you, I think of another one. But I guess I like them all really equally. I will say I think that it's cool that... I guess we can always like edit out if I'm thinking too long about this question.
Condiment King.
Exactly. Yeah,
say it, Colin.
Condiment King. Of course, Condiment King.
So that was one of the...
Yeah.
In my rewatching, that was one of the episodes where the Joker actually is like brainwashing these failed comedians, and that's where Condiment King came from. But when he tries to escape, he says, so it's a little bit of Shakespeare too. He says, "Parting is such sweet and sour, sour sorrow." And he doesn't butcher the line like I did, but I was like, see, that's, I wouldn't have appreciated that. I wouldn't have appreciated the pun as a little kid. And I wouldn't have appreciated the Shakespeare reference either. So it's like on 2 levels, you've just got,
all right.
Not that Condiment King is my answer. Sorry.
No, all right. So given a little bit of time to think about it, I will say my favorite male villain, let's just go Mr. Freeze. He's a great choice, right? I mean, he's tragic, but he's also neat. Like, it's cool that he's got the kind of like frozen mech suit thing, and he's just kind of he's cool looking, right? And being able to freeze things is pretty cool. And I mean, it's really convenient that he had that name, right? I mean, it's like destiny. Wow. It's like they did it on purpose. Wow. Who could have imagined?
Yeah. That's it. We hadn't even the significance of names in obviously just literature and fiction, but like that's a parallel to the Bible, obviously too.
That especially with Batman villains, like particular, all right. So my female Pamela Isley, Poison Ivy, right? Because Isley, Ivy, all the villains in Batman, all their actual names are,
Okay.
Manifest Destiny.
See, and maybe you didn't want to. Maybe you didn't want to excite this sort of thing, but obviously there's another kind of Namda whatever with Harley Quinn and her kind of persona
yes, certainly,
too.
certainly.
But very much a
little on the
which,
nose.
Again, that's just
but
that's just good writing.
That's what that is. That's just good writing. No,
mine was actually a toss up between Mr. Freeze and I hesitate, but then I went with the Mad Hatter because I think it was, and again, not even because it was just another like great literary reference, and I did have kind of a Alice in Wonderland or Lewis Carroll phase in college where I loved reading Lewis Carroll, the poetry, the kind of the backstory and all that stuff. But I think it's one of those like very, it's unnerving.
Is this when you were having your tea party phase, Mike? Is this congruent with that?
I'd like to think that they're independent of each other, but
the overlap's too hard to ignore. Yeah,
I think
he didn't have a lot of friends in college, but he had a lot of little plush toy friends, right, to make up for it. And that's where the tea set came in.
So, it's one of the, and obviously, like we both said at the outset, it has to be besides Joker because Joker's the obvious answer. And so maybe Mad Hatter is like too derivative or whatever. But it's just that unnerving sort of imbalance that kind of is off, that is somewhat scary. And when you think of, so many people see Batman as like almost hyper rational in his investigative approach, and so like you said, the bad guys are subverting or inverting an essential aspect of Batman, and then taking it to the extreme. And so you could kind of see
there's just something so vaguely Christian sounding about that.
Yeah, it's like every heresy that's ever existed, right? That's the thing is like you take the one good thing about the creed, one good thing about the faith at the expense of all the others, and there's your recipe for a heresy. And
that's exactly it. Every Batman villain is a heretical version of Batman.
Or just, the whole, like you said, the evil being a corruption of the good that's there. It's like it's taking that one
exactly,
good.
Yeah.
So no, and that honestly, that wasn't even one of the kind of the main, like the big themes, because again, not that those things aren't interesting and important to touch on, but we wanted to see like, are there some other sort of areas that we could investigate further? I mean, we could do a whole episode just on all the bad guys, right? Talking about obviously the Joker, Mr. Freeze, the big ones, but Mad Hatter is probably like a, B-list villain in regards to, maybe even C-list in regards to like Batman.
Oh yeah, it was kind of a deep cut. He's definitely B-list, but he's cool. Like his big shtick is kind of twofold. One is mind control, right? That's what he does. Is he goes and he manipulates people's experience of reality through mind control gadgetry. But then also there's a lot of like lunacy affiliated with him because of the Alice in Wonderland stuff and his general aesthetic and things like that. So this insanity and mind control, right, are kind of what he's going with there. And that makes him a super cool villain, frankly. I mean, people might find his aesthetic distasteful because he's so ugly, frankly, right? Like he's like one of those British, and I'm pretty sure this was intentionally. He's one of those British political cartoons from like the 19th century.
Yeah, actually, I hadn't even thought about that, but that's.
Yeah, and I can't remember if I'm making this up or if I read this somewhere, but fairly certain that was where they pulled it from. Like it was intentional. Yeah, so people, they kind of, whatever, dismiss him. But, he's a cool villain. But he's not considered A-list.
No,
at least I wouldn't.
Certainly not. And honestly, I think it sometimes is distorted from the most recent, especially the Christopher Nolan ones, where I don't think, like, Scarecrow would have been considered, like, until Batman Begins, I don't think Scarecrow would have been as, and I guess if in the comics it is so, and I'm just thinking of, again, I'm primarily thinking of the animated series, but
no, it's so the reason why the movies, Batman Begins was what, the 5th film, if you're not including the 66 film, if you're not including like the 40s films and things like that.
I guess I kind of see them as like their own thing anyway, so yeah.
Oh no, they are, but in behind the scenes, right? That story started as a sequel to the, Batman and Robin, the film that shall not be named, even though I just named it. But Scarecrow was a holdover from that. He was going to be the villain in the fifth film within the Burton Shoemaker movies because they were scratching the bottom of the barrel, right? Because they had already done all the cool ones. And so the only reason now they worked it into the Dark Knight trilogy really, really well, in my opinion. But yeah, he wasn't picked because of his cool factor. Even though, especially later Batman animated series, when they go and they start doing the adventures of Superman and they update the visual art style between both Batman and Superman so they look really, really in line with each other. And they do some redesigns on all the villains. And some of them are meh. Like, I don't like what they did to Catwoman in those later cartoons. But Scarecrow's redesign in the later cartoons, if you don't have an image of it in your head, it's freaking nightmare fuel, and it's awesome. They did a fantastic job with Scarecrow when they redesigned him. And he's a cool villain. He's all about being super scary, and I like horror movie stuff. So he's like the horror movie villain.
My guess would be also, I don't have any background knowledge or, in terms of the films, but my guess would also be that a lot of it came from just the performance of Cillian Murphy as Scarecrow in the Nolan series. Again, that's not a controversial thing to say that he's a great actor and always, added something very unique and interesting to that role too. So my guess would also be that may have played a role in him kind of rising up in terms of popularity or visibility and things like that.
Well, and I know that Killian's listening to us right now, so I hate to I hate to say this, Killian. I apologize, but he's creepy looking, right? Just in general, he's just a creepy looking dude. I'm sure he's
all the way to the bank, so
I'm sure he's a very, very nice and amazing, polite man, but he can play creepy intensity really well.
So, I guess moving from, we talked a little bit about the trauma and how that has not only informed Batman, but, you kind of even mentioned, not only are the villains a really good foil to some unique aspect of Batman, but one of the really big things about the formation of the villains is they do a really good job of showing how they were formed by this kind of greater systematic injustice that's within all of Gotham. And again, not just talking about the animated series primarily. I think a lot of the Batman canon story arcs, they do a really good job of showing how there's this even greater injustice that formed the villain. And again, obviously, to whatever degree it's fair that they respond the way they did. We don't have to, it's not like you're trying to justify it.
Well, yeah, take Mad Hatter, for example. He just, really had the hots for this chick.
Oh, jeez.
And then she, totally rejected him, bro. And so he obviously had to turn into an evil supervillain.
He's a hero for the incel sort of.
The system totally worked against him. Uh-huh. And he had to start taking over people's minds. Alice, man. He needed to get Alice.
I thought you were going to...
That's in the cartoon. That's in the animated series. That's the episode, the origin for him. I don't remember if that's true in the comics. But
and again, I don't know how much of this is muddled because I also did watch the more recent Gotham series for the first season. And then I didn't follow it as closely. But, the Riddler kind of has some again, not justifying it, but you recognize that there's these bigger problems that are creating these, and again, some of them more than others. I'm not gonna argue for the Mad Hatter's case, but but maybe Catwoman.
He's your favorite villain, Mike.
Maybe Catwoman is actually, and again, this is referring to the Tim Burton one too, where it's there was some justification for her response, for her anger or whatever. And so, and this is pre Me Too and all that stuff, but there's very much an injustice that is being addressed, even if it's in this distorted way. Whereas then you have...
Well, no, you're right. poking fun. Even you could even argue for the injustice affecting the kind of like, incel-like qualities of the Mad Hatter. The all the villains, to your point, are in some way responding to, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, some real tragedy or some real grievance that they have or whatever. And like
Mr. Freeze.
Oh, he's perfect. I mean, well, yeah. You could go through them. A very famous example that is controversial and uncertain as to whether it's canon or not. I think that they've done stuff with the Joker in recent years
that's tricky, yeah.
Kind of upset the apple cart when it comes to his origins and things like that. Famously, and correctly, I might add, he doesn't have an origin story because he is this, archetypal type agent of chaos character, and not just because Christopher Nolan made that really front and center. He did it brilliantly. But, that's always been the case, where, like, the less you know about the Joker, the better. Which is what made that movie so effective, is they stuck to that. But Alan Moore did a comic, The Killing Joke, in the 80s, and people don't like it because it's an origin story for Joker. But the entire story is about how unjust his life was, about how messed up his life was, and some really, really bad things happen to him, and he loses everything completely outside of his attempt to do the right thing. And it drives him crazy, and that's where the Joker comes from, according to that comic.
And that's I remember that one, but like I said, I sometimes will conflate it with all the other sort of Batman or Joker related things, because then you have the Joaquin Phoenix, where he's the like failed stand-up comedian and all that stuff, the most recent Joker movie. But then they actually refer to that in the Batman animated series. So they show like old footage of the Joker as a comedian who I think he loses this like stand-up comedy competition, and he eventually like goes after the judges and tries to get revenge or whatever. So that was one of the episodes I watched last night, actually. So
that was okay. I think I was trying to remember what you're talking about. I think I don't know if that was an origin of him. I think that was him. He disguises as a comedian just to show everyone that he's funny because he's funny, and the judges don't think he's funny. So then he rips off his Joker disguise, which is like, I guess, just him or something like that, and then just goes full Joker on them or something like that.
That's like in the latter half of the episode. But
it actually has flashbacks
when they're trying to,
or something.
So it's like they're showing, it's like a videotape of like the TV episode, not like a real flashback. But
okay, I forgot about that.
That one's actually, I think, a season 2 one, if I remember. I don't know. I jumped around. So.
Well, let me bring back in some of the Christian themes to what we're talking about, though, because like I know. Oh, Batman, you're too cool, bro. But you know who else is cool? Jesus, kids.
Oh boy.
Everything about the villains and about Batman and all that stuff is.
You know what Batman didn't have in his utility belt? Grace.
That's true. That's very true.
Boo.
I know. How far is too far when you're talking about holy things, But it's a pretty short walk off that bridge, folks. It's always a response to sin. It's always a response to, chaos or anarchy or sin or anything that's not of God, right? And then it's depending upon the choices that are being made, whether it's by Batman or by his villains, is this poor response or positive response. Either way, though, it's a response to the nature of this world, right? And the nature of corruption that we deal with as human beings. And what Batman's villains do is they experience the injustice of it. They experience the hardship of corruption and suffering. And then they go bonkers. They go crazy. And usually they're trying to do something that's at least got some kind of positive idea behind it.
Even the response to trauma or injustice, like you said, that in and of itself is a sort of, it's based off of Christianity, or we could say Christians' understanding of God, because, the whole thing about, from a, not just Christian, but even like a classical theistic perspective of God is that God is infinite goodness. And that doesn't just mean that God is going to like magic away the bad and make the good. It's that goodness is communicated through instrumental causes of goodness, which is what we are. And so, again, not that Batman is articulating this, but he has this response to trauma, response to injustice, but it's his love for Gotham, his love for justice. He becomes an instrumental cause.
His love for his father, Mike.
Thomas, yeah. Which, well, anyway, that's where you can, the Thomas Wayne, they've expanded on that character a lot more, even since we were kids, for better or worse.
This is why Batman the Animated Series is still the litmus test, folks. I love all the different permutations, but they're always lesser than, because they're messing around with the magic sauce. They're the correct recipe, right? And they're interesting. They're always interesting, but they're never as good, true, and beautiful as Batman the Animated Series is.
And again, it speaks to that desire of we want to participate in the good. And yeah, whether you agree with or not that Batman the Animated Series is the kind of, what would you say, the archetype of Batman or whatever.
Mm-hmm. The perfect distillation. How about that?
The fact that everything since then has been somewhat derivative from it, it just shows that we want to participate in that goodness. But it's the same thing, like I said, going back to, kind of bringing it a little bit full circle or small circle to not that Batman's going to articulate, because God is infinite goodness, he wants to use me as an instrumental cause of that goodness. But that's exactly what even Batman in his kind of, he wants to be that inspiration, right? And be the inspiration that Harvey Dent couldn't be when he turned into Two-Face. But it was supposed to be, he was the model, right? In the same way that, saints are modeling themselves after Christ. But it's infinite goodness, and then we become instrumental causes of that principal goodness that is God. And so it just, and whether, and obviously nobody does it perfectly. And so, but everybody also does it uniquely.
Well, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? And those good intentions, in the long run, are always ourselves trying to reflect God back, because that's in our nature to do, right? And yet, it's because we want power to correct evil, right? Or we want, all the satanic sins that Satan tries to tempt Jesus with after he's out fasting in the wilderness, right? We want to be able to just like create food, or we want to be able to just take control of things, and it's always for a good cause, right? But without the proper balance and without putting God and Christ first and having the proper ideal, in Batman's case, nothing's going to be explicitly Christian in what he's doing, but especially if we're using the animated series because of its kind of perfect, reality. It's not that character, especially in the early seasons, let's say, is not this heavily flawed, kind of like losing battle, right? And he's really, really rooted to a sense of goodness and justice.
He's still more hero than anti-hero.
He is. He's very much still hero than anti-hero.
Which, especially the Nolan series, they flirt with kind of the anti-hero role. They almost actually like shove it right in front of you with the Dark Knight story.
Well, and that's I actually just watched just because I knew we were going to be doing this podcast. You might have heard of Jonathan Pajot. Maybe people listening to this, come on. But
I was going to say, if somebody's listening to ours, they've listened to him because
right, exactly, yeah.
He's a pretty big name.
He evidently went through quite the Batman phase when he was a kid, and he has a bunch of Batman related videos. One of them is talking about fighting, this craziness that we experience in reality these days, and using the Dark Knight as an example of like what that looks like. And the anti-hero nature of the Dark Knight movie by Christopher Nolan, it's true. It's there. And I mean, it's always going to be there. Batman, by definition, because he personifies darkness and he takes on this kind of like quote unquote evil persona in order to terrorize bad guys with it and things like that. Well, that's true. I mean, that's true even of my beloved animated series, litmus test. That's you ruin, I mean, it's what makes Batman cool, right? But it's also integral to who he is. So anti-hero is fine to an extent, though, because if you go too far with it, you turn him into somebody like, you turn him into what basically sinful people want him to be. They want to bring Batman down
a justification
into the mud.
for it's a justification for it. Mm-hmm. And so we're definitely going to have an extended conversation on the role of darkness, because again, obviously you have to, if you're going to talk about Batman and Christianity, you're going to have to talk about darkness.
Mike, sometimes you have to touch the darkness in order to recognize the light.
Yeah, so obviously,
I think that's, I heard that
you just
recently.
You just made that up, I think.
I don't know. I got that from somewhere, but it just struck me as like really profound wisdom when I first heard it. So
is it going to be famous enough, or will that series have kind of gone away from people's minds by the time this episode airs? For those of you who, I don't know, for better or worse, did not view the Rings of Power series, that became a huge theme, especially in the series premiere and the season 1 finale.
They do a callback.
Yeah. So,
hey, works for me, man. Let's do it.
I don't think you. The last time we spoke, I don't think you'd actually seen the finale yet, or maybe
it's true.
I don't know.
I did. No, I did. No, you're right, and I'd have since watched it. So we'll talk about it. I'm sure we'll do a whole episode on it or something to that effect. But
because just like nobody's talked about Batman yet, nobody's taled about Lord of the Rings and Rings of Power. So
yeah, I know we're catching all the crumbs, Mike. we're seeking out actively the niche, topics that have not been overplayed or overdone. I mean, come on, right? So that's what you're gonna find in this podcast. My loyal audience is that we're going to be doing the hard-hitting, deep dives into
what everybody's too
the
afraid to
lesser known.
Talk about.
Yeah, we're not afraid. We're not afraid to talk about Batman. We're not afraid to talk about Lord of the Rings. We might even talk about Marvel. I mean, I'm not. That's some things are maybe a little too far, but
those won't get their whole episode. We might make allusions to it, but anyway. So one of these, again, what other Christian reasons, quote unquote, why people just still are fascinated with, or Christians specifically are fascinated with Batman. I think we talked a lot about Gotham, talked a lot about, just responding to trauma and stuff. One of the things that I remember actually not noticing, and that's because Superman doesn't have much of a presence, if at all. I can't think of an episode off the top of my head where Superman's in the animated series, but obviously there's a lot of conversation, a lot of examples of Superman and Batman. And I remember when I first saw being struck by the mistrust that Batman has. And it comes from, again, Batman's kind of generally suspicious attitude of kind of just, this is too good to be true sort of thing, not trusting, I guess, in general. But
this is why Batman is better when it's just Batman. It's also why most of DC's other properties, in the comics anyway, like half the publications that DC put out, at least it used to be this way, I'm sure it still is, are Batman world comics, right? And then obviously you have things like Justice League and Superman, things like that, but like half their output is basically Batman centric in some capacity because he's just really dynamite, right? But if you introduce, what happens when you introduce Superman into Batman's world is suddenly all the levity and all the good qualities that are present in like the early seasons of Batman the Animated Series, they get removed from Bruce Wayne in Batman and they get given to Superman. So that
he has
Superman
to become a foil.
Yeah, they have to. And I mean, listen, it's not like they don't do this, right? Like they're great foils for each other in this regard. But because people tend to be whatever, it's hard for people to hit balance, I guess. I'll just leave it at that. But what tends to happen is that Batman becomes a caricature of himself. And Superman, I don't know if you can caricature Superman. He's kind of a caricature to begin with. And I like Superman. I love Superman, but no, I love him. My angsty teenage son dismisses Superman, and I'm always arguing with him about how cool Superman is and how good he is. But my son's a product of a cynical, jaded society who thinks that the big blue Boy Scout's just boring and stupid. And it's
so you should tell him that he's being like Lois Lane then, and then he'll snap out of it. Because I mean,
you're being a real
classic.
Lex Luthor, son. No, what happened? Like Superman stays himself because Superman. That the problem that my son has with him and everybody else has with him is that he's considered one note and that it's hard to like do things with his character, blah, blah. But that being said, what's true about that criticism is that he's very consistent as a character. Batman turns into this grimdark jerk who doesn't trust, like Batman v Superman, Dawn of Terrible movie titles. That the whole storyline is like, I don't trust him. He's an alien. He 9/11'd Metropolis, and we can't trust them. Like that's what Batman becomes, even in other mediums, not just that movie.
I was gonna say,
right?
wasn't even thinking of that specifically. I was thinking of like previous iterations, but anyway, go on.
Oh yeah, always. Yeah, it's always how they portray it, and it's not untrue. It's not like that doesn't make sense. And there's Batman. He always has a contingency plan, right? And that's he's the Sherlock Holmes of the DC universe kind of thing. And he's always 10 steps ahead of everybody. There's this really, really great comic storyline from I think it was the 2000s where there's some bad guys and they've managed to incapacitate all of the Justice League. They're off-worlders though. And so they've gotten, everybody under their thumb, but they ignored Batman because according to these aliens, he's just a dude. Like, he's just a dude. Like, why do we even have to worry? He's not Superman. He's not Green Lantern, And Superman's like, you just let slip between your fingers the most dangerous man on the planet. And that's how Superman defines Batman, right? I don't know what put that in my head. I just love sharing that anecdote because it's one of the great all-time moments in comics when it comes to Superman and Batman's relationship.
And I think obviously shows the healthy admiration and respect, but why this is a Christian reason? I mean, I think very much Christians are sort of like, we have this sort of veil of tears that we're not supposed to put all of our hope in, even when especially when things are too good to be true. That's when we're at the most risk of becoming who we're not as Christians, right? Of losing our faith, of becoming lukewarm, of basically losing sight on the goal is not of this world. And so I think that healthy suspicion, even in a character like Superman, which I would say the analogy maybe falls because Superman is not of this world. And so you can kind of say like, that's where Batman is becoming, too skeptical, so to speak. And he can be that symbol, in this conversation too. But that's where, his suspicion of Superman as too good to be true, which as you've kind of pointed out, we've all kind of followed Batman in a lot of ways, for better or worse.
Well, earlier in the podcast, I was like, Batman and his villains make choices related to the suffering that they've experienced, for better or for worse. And what I was hinting at when I said that was that Batman doesn't always make the right choice. I mean, surprise, surprise, everyone, if you've ever watched any Batman stuff ever. But he's got a lot of hubris, right? And he has a lot of cynicism that is present, right, in any version of Batman. And so when he's confronted with a transcendent figure like Superman, and it's funny how much people find Superman boring and dislike him and things like that. And it's because he's literally like the most Christ-like, comic character ever. And I think it represents our inability to love like we're meant to love, like what we innately love, but we are enamored and blinded by this world into preferring the darkness and things like that.
Well, there again, yeah, it's always that combination of you're immersed in the world of the darkness, but you still are kind of looking towards the light, to sound kind of corny, I guess.
No, it's totally fine. We did talk a little bit about Gotham, maybe, but we probably didn't give it its due. Like, Gotham is the world, right?
It's a character. It's very
It
much
is.
as important a character as, yeah.
What a novel insight you just had.
I know,
Mike.
I know.
I mean, where'd you come up with that, dude?
It's fresh perspectives. That's what you sign
That's
up
what
for.
we bring to you on this podcast. He's right, because everyone will say that too, that Gotham itself is a character. Well, yeah. Gotham itself is this cesspool of villainy and corruption and systemic injustice and good people trying to make a day's wage and failing and everything. It's everything exaggerated that we experience in our own reality, right? And Batman's goal is to take the hurt that he experienced from that world and transform it into something that can help save that world. And that's his whole mission in a nutshell. And that's what we're called to do. Is we are here. When God made this place, he didn't intend for it to be this fallen cesspool. And that wasn't his primary goal, let's say. I know that Mike has some kind of like highfalutin theological language for it, of what I'm describing. But it wasn't his, primary goal. But he knew it was going to be the case. Adam and Eve's fall was not a surprise, right? They didn't catch God flat-footed. And without, getting out of my element, right, or swimming into the theological deep end too far, I've always considered that the suffering of this life, as demonstrated by Jesus, is necessary for our formation, right? And that creation's groaning for the full revelation of us, as St. Paul talks about in Romans. And it just had to be this way. And we need to take, so it means that we're going to hurt, we're going to feel pain, but we got to take the pain and we got to turn it into something that can help save the world, like Jesus and like Batman.
Well, and like you said, not to piggyback off it too far and go down too much of a rabbit trail, but even if you don't want to go so far as to say like the physical suffering, which is obviously the result of sin, so to speak, or our death being a result of sin, even if you look at just the actions of the three persons of the Trinity, the Son always had this pouring out of himself, which, you could use the term sacrificial even before the foundation of the world. And so, Jesus doing it in the flesh, that's just a, what you want to say, a continuation or an incarnation of what the Son had already been doing for all eternity. And so, like you were saying, it's not so much saying, that it was necessary in the sense that God couldn't have done it otherwise. If God's omnipotent, God could do it otherwise. And this gets into, so the language that Aquinas would use is fittingness. It was fitting. It was more fitting to God's nature to not first become human, to become incarnate in the first place. I shouldn't say to take on a human nature, and then to suffer and die. It's not that God had to, in the sense that it couldn't have worked another way. It was fitting to the nature of the Son, which from all eternity, by virtue of him being the second person of the Trinity, was pouring of himself out. And so we see it, in the historical example of the crucifixion. But in a sense, that's just, that was already there. And so that, our small participations in that, whether it's through our own lives or, within characters in fiction, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't know, mm-hmm. I can't think of a, I think most often people use Superman as like the Jesus example, where they'll show him like cruciform on the cover of a comic, or they'll show him like, it
come
looks
back
like
to
he's,
dead. Come back to life from the dead after being killed by something called Doomsday.
So there's not as much of, and probably because it's a little bit more subtle with Batman, but he's very much as much a Christ figure as Superman is, and probably in, not in a way that we deserve, to paraphrase another line from Batman. He's the Christ figure that we deserve, so to speak. But
he's the Christ figure we need, not the one we deserve.
Excuse me. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there you go. I paraphrased it too much.
No. So Superman and Batman are good foils, right? And they're both Christ-like in their own way. If Superman is the transcendent logos son of, God, Batman, I suppose, could be his human nature, the human incarnational concept, because he's very, and this is really, really intentional, he doesn't have superpowers, right? Like, he has money, right? Like, that's his superpower, right? But
there's a sort of self-emptying. And I want to just put in a quick plug for one of the mini-sodes that we're going to release in between these conversations. I wanted to do one on kenosis, so that self-emptying, like you said. If Superman is showing the transcendent or the divine, so to speak, Batman is showing that when the divine empties himself, as Jesus did, we call that kenosis, and I'm not going to go any further because that's what the mini-sode will be. But you very much see that in, his entering into the darkness of Gotham. But sorry, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great, actually. And it's, Bruce Wayne is super wealthy and surrounded by beautiful women and luxury cars and the most eligible bachelor in Gotham, all that good stuff. But he empties himself of all that. His actual he's an ascetic, right? And so on the one hand, just like what I was saying was that he represents like Christ his humanity, right? Or a Christ-like humanity. But because of that, you can branch it down into like the saints and like the classic Christian examples of ascetic purity, where he haunts all these, areas of luxury and visual symbols of worldly esteem, visual symbols of success and power, and he takes no pleasure from any of it. He uses his money, his wealth, right, to create all those wonderful toys. I made that line up. And
there again, that's for that deeper purpose anyway. It's not for his own good, it's for the good of others.
Mm-hmm. Every now and again,
his miracles weren't for, it was for ultimately for us to have faith, right? So.
Mm-hmm. Oh, here's a Catholic thing, because I'm not Catholic, folks. But I'll give this one to Mike. Yeah. And I'll say this because maybe I'm not a representative of Catholic teaching, so I don't know if I'm getting it wrong or not. But the kind of treasury of grace, right? Or this idea that Christ gives out like from his wealth, quote unquote, of the grace, and is able to use that, grace money, right? Like, I think those merits and
rather indulgent. Yeah, he can be rather indulgent with his grace. Sure.
Well, no, but I mean, I'm not even trying to pick at it. I'm trying to use it as a real example of there's another kind of correlation between the wealth of Batman and how he uses it.
Well, so what I think you're kind of alluding to or stumbling towards is like you said, and why I said he's rather indulgent is because that is kind of the basis for indulgences, is that it's not just about Jesus, it's Jesus's unity to his body, the church. And so that grace that Jesus won, Jesus the head, won on the cross, is united to his body, the church. And so there's still that capacity to, whenever we talk about the like you said, receiving merit or being granted indulgences, things like that, it ultimately originates from Christ's work on the cross, but it's because of his unity to the church that we get to experience that.
And we probably not going to have time to get into it. We'll end up doing multiple episodes, I'm sure, on this. I don't know if they'll be consecutive or not, but
I relabeled it part 1.
Yeah, it's good idea. Forward thinking. But, his relationship with Robins, like the various Robins that come in and out of his life throughout the years and things like that. Next time we talk about this stuff, we can talk about his influence on the people around him, his relationship with those around him, and both the positives and negatives of it. I'm pretty nerdy when it comes to Batman and feel like we barely scratched the surface of just what we could get out of this from a Christian perspective. And it's why he's so popular, is because he's so applicable to reality.
And not just in some ways we kind of touched on some of the basic overview of Christian things. We kind of gave each other a hard time because we were also somewhat basic in some of the themes that we brought up, but hopefully this wasn't just a rehashing of a Christian Batman episode or a Christian Batman perspective. That I think some of these things, they weren't things that at least I've come across in the different, whether it's podcasts, YouTube videos, the different mediums, or the different blog posts and articles that I've read about, the Christian symbolism in Batman or whatever. So hopefully there were some sort of like different facets of the diamond that is, Christian symbolism in Batman.
Is there one of those
at least
Gospels according to Batman? Does that exist?
Honestly, I'm sure there is. That's not even, there has to be.
There has to be, right?
Those I've found, because I've found those for other topics, and I've kind of I got a little bored of those, and I was kind of going through those. So but there again, because it has to be very surfacey.
Can we name this podcast The Gospel According to Batman?
If we want clicks, I guess. Yeah.
I like clicks.
Gospel According to Batman, part 1, but then we'll have to put in parentheses like the good version of it or something.
Yeah, the good news version.
Talk about hubris.
Yeah, I know.
So yeah, no, we're definitely coming back to this. I don't, like you said, I don't know if they're going to be consecutive. We have lots of different avenues that I want to explore. We didn't even get to some of the resources that you talked about, but. Yeah, there's just so much that...
We'll just do a yearly annual episode.
Well, I was going to say, we didn't even... we did make some references to Nolan, but we didn't even really get into the deeper themes of Nolan. We just wanted to talk about the animated series because of the passing of Kevin Conroy, and, we had talked about a lot, just both of us independently, our enjoyment of and our formation by the Batman animated series before we'd ever talked about doing a podcast or anything like that. So, no, this was, I enjoyed this. I look forward to our next conversation about this. Thanks, Jacob.
Yep, it was wonderful, Mike. I always love talking about Batman.
And thanks to all of you guys who joined us for this conversation about, the Christian symbolism in Batman, how unique. We hope it was fun. And that you guys got something a little bit new and unique out of it. Stay tuned for some of those mini-sodes that we want to release in between each of these conversations. Like I said earlier in the episode, I want this one to be a lot about kenosis, but we haven't even gotten to apophatic or apophaticism when talking about Batman and darkness, so that's going to be one of those coming up too. Subscribe to the Voyage podcast so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. We hope you join us on our next conversation with Batman, the spiritual themes, the just interesting kind of connections that we can make to both of our branches of Christianity, spirituality, me being Catholic, Jacob being Eastern Orthodox. And we will talk to you guys. Join us next time. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.